Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the battle for control in Port Charles was far more than just a struggle between rival mafia factions. It was a calculated, deadly game of power, deception, and manipulation, where every move had long-lasting consequences. Sidwell, a man whose mind was as sharp as a blade and whose actions were driven by an unrelenting thirst for dominance, had entered this world like a storm, determined to tear down Sonny's empire and take control of the underworld that Sonny had spent decades building. The stakes were higher than ever, and the game had just begun. From the moment Sidwell set foot in Port Charles, the city's delicate balance began to shift. Unlike many of the mafia figures Sonny had dealt with in the past, Sidwell wasn't interested in small-time turf wars or petty rivalries. No, Sidwell had a much larger ambition in mind. His sights were set on Sonny, the man at the top of the mafia food chain. And he wasn't about to stop until he had dismantled every part of Sonny's empire. Sidwell wasn't just here to make money, he was here to destroy Sonny and everything he had built. The power and respect Sonny commanded in Port Charles were too great for Sidwell to ignore, and he intended to take it all for himself. The first move in Sidwell's game came in the form of a well-timed attack on Sonny's daughter, Christina. By causing her to be caught in the blaze of Charlie's restaurant, Sidwell was not just making a statement, he was sending a direct message to Sonny. It was an act of cruelty designed to provoke Sonny into a reaction, and it worked. Sonny's love for his family was his greatest weakness, and Sidwell knew this. What he didn't count on was how Sonny would react. Sonny, known for his ice-cold demeanor and relentless focus, found himself pushed to the edge by Sidwell's actions. But instead of letting his emotions cloud his judgment, Sonny did what he did best, he planned. His response wasn't a blind act of rage. It was a cold, calculated retaliation designed to send a clear message to Sidwell. The kidnapping of Marco, Sidwell's trusted ally, was not an impulsive decision, it was part of Sonny's greater strategy. By taking Marco, Sonny wasn't just exacting revenge, he was sending a signal to Sidwell that he wasn't going to let anyone, especially someone as treacherous as Sidwell, come into his city and disrupt the delicate balance he had established. However, Sidwell, ever the strategist, wasn't so easily intimidated. He quickly recognized that the battle between him and Sonny wasn't going to be won by brute force alone. This wasn't a simple fight for territory, it was a battle of wits. A long-term game where every move had to be calculated and every contingency planned for. Sidwell had a vision of taking over Port Charles, but he knew that in order to do so, he had to break Sonny from the inside. That's when Sidwell turned his attention to Sonny's most precious asset, his family. The next phase of Sidwell's plan was devastatingly simple. Attack Sonny where it hurt most. He set his sights on Michael, Sonny's son, and devised a scheme to manipulate the custody battle between Michael and Willow for the children. Sidwell, using his wealth and influence, bribed the judge to award custody to Michael, a move that would not only weaken Sonny's position but would also throw a wrench into the family's dynamics. The stakes were high. If Sidwell's plan succeeded, Sonny would not only lose custody of his children but would also be implicated in a bribery scandal that could ruin his reputation and his empire. It was a move designed to strip Sonny of everything he held dear. What Sidwell didn't account for, however, was Michael's determination. Sonny's son, despite the many challenges he had faced growing up under his father's shadow, was no stranger to the ruthless games of the underworld. Michael wasn't the same man he had been years ago. His experiences had shaped him into someone who was just as capable of playing the long game as Sidwell. When Michael learned of Sidwell's plans to undermine Sonny, he didn't panic or lash out. Instead, he took a step back and began to piece together the full extent of Sidwell's plot. What followed was nothing short of a masterstroke. Michael, using his intelligence and carefully laid plans, began to expose the cracks in Sidwell's armor. He dug deeper into the judge's financials, uncovering the bribe that Sidwell had paid, and began to turn the tide in Sonny's favor. The more Michael uncovered, the more Sidwell's carefully constructed house of cards began to crumble. Sidwell, who had thought he was in control, now found himself at the mercy of the very family he had sought to destroy. But Michael's victory was not without cost. Though he had exposed Sidwell's treachery and safeguarded his father's empire, the damage had already been done. Sonny had been pushed to the brink, and the Corinthos family's vulnerabilities had been laid bare for all to see. Sidwell, though defeated for the moment, was far from done. He had a vast network of allies in Port Charles and beyond, and he wasn't about to let one setback stop him from achieving his goals. He would regroup, find new ways to strike, and wait for the right moment to return. For Sonny, Michael's triumph over Sidwell had come at a heavy price. He had learned a valuable lesson: no matter how much power he held, no matter how many enemies he destroyed, there would always be those lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The fight for control in Port Charles was far from over. And Sonny knew that the game had only just begun. Sidwell, like many before him, would be back, and next time, he wouldn't be so easy to defeat. As the dust settled, Sonny stood at the center of the storm, his family shaken but intact. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The mafia world of Port Charles was a volatile, ever-changing landscape. And Sonny would need every ounce of his cunning and strength to protect his family from the forces that threatened to tear them apart. The stakes had never been higher, and the enemies more dangerous. But one thing was certain: Sonny would fight to the very end to keep control of his empire, and his family. Sidwell had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to control the situation, to orchestrate events from behind the scenes, manipulating those around him like pawns in a grand game. His plan to dismantle Sonny's empire was carefully constructed, with every move designed to exploit Sonny's vulnerabilities, to break him from within. However, what Sidwell had not anticipated was the resilience of Michael, Sonny's son. Once seen as an innocent bystander in his father's world, had evolved into a formidable force of his own. Michael wasn't just going to sit back and let his family fall apart. He was going to fight for everything he held dear. And he would do it on his terms. From the very beginning, Michael had been motivated by something far more powerful than vengeance. He had been driven by a profound sense of family. His love for Sonny, his father, was the core of his being. And it had fueled his determination to protect what was left of their fractured family. Unlike his father, who had always been the head of the family, Michael's approach was far more methodical, more cerebral. He understood the stakes, and he knew that the battle against Sidwell would not be won through brute force but through strategy and intellect. Michael didn't rush into the fight. He observed, calculated, and waited for the right moment to strike. He wasn't interested in flashy displays of power or open confrontations. Instead, he focused on understanding Sidwell's every move. He knew that Sidwell's plan was intricate, built on years of careful manipulation, but he also understood that even the most carefully laid plans had weaknesses. It was these weaknesses that Michael set out to expose. With the help of trusted allies, friends who shared his loyalty to the family, Michael began to dig deeper into Sidwell's activities. His first breakthrough came when he uncovered the bribery of the judge in the custody battle. Sidwell had paid off the judge to ensure that Michael would lose custody of his children. A move that would not only damage Sonny's reputation but also weaken him in the eyes of the people who mattered most in Port Charles. However, Michael didn't just find the evidence. He carefully studied the connections between Sidwell and other figures in the town. He knew that Sidwell wasn't working alone, there were other forces at play. Dark connections that tied Sidwell to the underbelly of Port Charles. As Michael pieced together the puzzle, he realized that Sidwell's plan was not just about winning the custody battle or tarnishing Sonny's reputation, it was a power play designed to destroy Sonny's empire from the inside out. Sidwell's connections to criminal elements in Port Charles were far more extensive than anyone had realized, and if Michael didn't act quickly, those forces would begin to tear apart everything Sonny had worked for. But Michael wasn't afraid. He was focused, resolute, and determined to save his family. The next phase of Michael's strategy was to turn the tables on Sidwell. He knew that Sidwell thought he had already won, that he had set the perfect trap for Sonny. Sidwell had manipulated everyone around him, playing them against each other, and now it seemed like he had Sonny exactly where he wanted him. But Michael, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity in Sidwell's arrogance. Sidwell's confidence blinded him to the fact that Michael was not just a pawn in his game, he was a player. Just as capable of manipulation and cunning as Sidwell himself. With a calmness that belied the stakes, Michael began to act. He used the evidence he had gathered to undermine Sidwell's credibility, exposing the bribery and his connections to the criminal elements of Port Charles. As Sidwell's carefully constructed empire of lies began to collapse, Michael made sure to keep his father out of the public eye, protecting Sonny from the fallout of Sidwell's machinations. But Michael didn't stop there. He used his position to rally the forces of the family, aligning himself with key figures in Port Charles who were also threatened by Sidwell's rise to power. He called in favors, made alliances, and slowly began to turn the tide in Sonny's favor. Sidwell, for all his planning and power, could not foresee the storm Michael was bringing. Just when he thought he had secured victory, Michael emerged as the wild card, a force that shattered everything Sidwell had worked for. It wasn't just about exposing Sidwell's illegal activities. It was about showing him that no matter how many pieces he moved on the chessboard, Michael would always be one step ahead. The tables had turned, and Sidwell, once the predator, was now the prey. In the aftermath of Michael's brilliant move, Sidwell found himself backed into a corner. The very people who had once supported him began to question his motives, his integrity. The connections he had relied on to maintain his power began to unravel, and the truth about his treachery came to light. Michael had not only saved his father from the trap Sidwell had set, but he had also made Sidwell's position untenable. The shock of Michael's actions reverberated throughout Port Charles, and Sidwell found himself facing consequences he had never imagined. But Michael's victory wasn't just about the collapse of Sidwell's plan, it was a personal triumph. For the first time, Michael had stepped out from Sonny's shadow and proved that he was more than capable of handling the world they both inhabited. His love for his family, his relentless determination, and his strategic thinking had made him a force to be reckoned with. In many ways, this moment marked a turning point for Michael. A moment when he fully embraced the legacy of the Corinthos family and proved that he was ready to fight for it. For Sidwell, the consequences of his failure were just beginning. He had underestimated Michael's resolve, and in doing so, he had exposed himself as a man who could not be trusted. His downfall wasn't just a result of the legal consequences he faced, it was the collapse of his reputation, his alliances, and his carefully constructed world. Sidwell may have had the power to destroy lives, but in the end, it was Michael's love for his family and his unshakable commitment to protecting them that had proven stronger. As Michael stood victorious, the battle for Port Charles was far from over. Sidwell's defeat was a significant victory, but it was only one chapter in a much larger story. Michael knew that the power struggles in Port Charles were never truly over, and there would always be others waiting in the wings, ready to make their move. But for now, he had won the most important battle of all, not just for his father, but for his family's future. And in this world of constant danger and deceit, that was the greatest victory he could have ever hoped for. The price of victory in the game of power and deception in Port Charles had never been so clear, nor so high. The victory over Sidwell, though hard-earned, was only a fleeting triumph in what would inevitably become a far greater and more dangerous war. While Sidwell had been temporarily defeated, his defeat was by no means the end of the story. Far from it. Sidwell, a man whose mind was always calculating, always plotting, was not the type to fold after a single loss. Instead, he would retreat, regroup, and prepare for his next move, all while silently preparing to exact a vengeance far more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. Sidwell had not just been a mere pawn in a game of mafia power struggles. He was an embodiment of the undercurrents of the criminal world, quiet, lurking, and dangerous in the way he operated in the shadows, pulling strings and manipulating others. His defeat had been humiliating, but it was also a lesson learned. Sidwell had gained insight into his enemies, and he was not about to let this opportunity slip by without making plans for his retaliation. He still had resources, allies in places no one had anticipated, and a deep understanding of how to strike at his enemies where they were most vulnerable. Sonny and Michael may have thought they had won a significant victory, but the real battle had only just begun. They might have defeated Sidwell's most direct plan, but his web of influence stretched far wider than either of them could have imagined. Michael, driven by his deep love and loyalty to his family, had acted decisively, using his sharp intellect and strategic mind to unravel Sidwell's plot. The bribery of the judge, the carefully constructed facade of loyalty, the web of criminal ties Sidwell had built, all of it was exposed, leaving Sidwell vulnerable. But in this world, vulnerability was a temporary state. Sidwell was not going to stay down for long. He was a man with a plan for everything, and he would find new ways to regain his footing. The real danger for Sonny and Michael, however, came not just from Sidwell's desire for revenge but from the complex, interconnected web of criminal power that surrounded them. While Sidwell was undoubtedly a formidable enemy, he was also just one piece in a larger puzzle, and the forces that supported him were still out there. Those who had benefited from Sidwell's rise to power were not going to sit idly by, especially when they saw the potential for further disruption to the balance of power in Port Charles. Sonny and Michael now had to navigate a dangerous landscape where every move they made could spark new conflicts, both from external enemies and from within their own family. The victory Sonny had claimed, though significant, was a hollow one. Yes, he had prevented Sidwell from executing his immediate plans, but the win had come at a high cost. The web of criminal alliances and corrupt connections that Sidwell had cultivated over the years was still very much intact. Sidwell's allies in Port Charles, some known, many still hidden in the shadows, were eager to make their move, to pick up where he had left off. And now, they saw an opportunity in the weakness that Sidwell's failure had revealed. They were like vultures circling a fallen prey, waiting for the right moment to swoop in and claim their prize. Sonny and Michael had spent so long fighting against external enemies that they had barely begun to address the real issue at hand, the internal cracks within their family. The Corinthos Empire was not just about power in the streets, it was about loyalty, trust, and unity within the family. These cracks had begun to show in the wake of Sidwell's schemes. The battle against Sidwell had brought out the best in Michael, showing him to be just as capable as his father in handling the pressure of their dangerous world. But it had also exposed a growing rift between them. Michael had grown into his role, and his relationship with Sonny had begun to shift. Michael wasn't the young boy who needed protection anymore, he was becoming his own man, with his own ideas about how the family business should be run. And that raised questions. Could the family hold together in the face of such internal strife? Could Sonny and Michael find common ground? Or would their differing views of the future create a rift that would tear the family apart? Sonny, the patriarch, had always carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had built the empire from the ground up, using his cunning, ruthlessness, and an unshakable resolve. But as the stakes continued to rise, he was finding it increasingly difficult to protect his family from the chaos that came with this life. He had lived through wars, betrayals, and countless power struggles, but each time, it seemed like the cost was greater. Sidwell's actions had left a scar on Sonny, one that went deeper than just the threat of losing his empire. It was the realization that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't protect his family forever. The weight of that burden was beginning to show. But Michael was different. He wasn't just protecting what was his, he was fighting to reshape the future of the Corinthos family. His desire to protect his father and his legacy was undeniable. But he was also beginning to see things differently. The lessons he had learned from his father and from his own experiences had begun to shape his own vision for the future. Michael was no longer content to stay in Sonny's shadow. He wanted more than just to carry on the family legacy, he wanted to forge his own path. To take control of his destiny in a way that Sonny had never done. This growing divide, though subtle at first, was starting to affect the way the family operated. While the outside world posed a threat, it was the fractures within the family that could prove to be the most dangerous. Sidwell, meanwhile, was quietly preparing his next move. His defeat was only temporary, and he was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. He had seen the vulnerabilities in Sonny's empire. And he knew where to hit to cause the most damage. He wasn't a man to let go of a grudge easily, and the sting of his defeat would only fuel his desire for revenge. Sidwell knew that Michael, Sonny's son, was the key to everything. If he could break Michael, he could break Sonny. It was no longer just about taking over Port Charles, it was about taking everything from Sonny. About shattering the very foundation of his family. Sidwell had learned enough to know that Sonny's greatest strength, his family, was also his greatest weakness. As Sonny and Michael prepared for the inevitable return of Sidwell's wrath, they had to confront not only the external threats looming over them but also the internal conflicts that threatened to tear their family apart. The war for Port Charles was far from over. And though Sonny and Michael had emerged victorious in the battle against Sidwell, they knew that the real struggle was just beginning. Sidwell had been a formidable foe. But the true cost of this victory was still to be paid, both in blood and in the relationships that would be tested in the coming months. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fight for the future of the Corinthos family would be more complex and dangerous than anything they had faced before.